Russia's invasion into Ukraine has divided the world. The United States and its allies in the West have tried to project a united front against Russian aggression. But Russia too has mustered its allies. So let's take a look at who has backed the war and who has condemned it in unequivocal terms and who has remained neutral during Europe's worst crisis since the World War II. Let's start with the US-sponsored draft resolution at the UNSC. The draft sought to deplore in the strongest terms Russia's aggression against Ukraine. The draft resolution was bound to fail. Russia, as a permanent member, vetoed the draft. China, India and the United Arab Emirates abstained from voting, while 11 nations, including the 3 permanent members like the US, UK and France, and 8 non-permanent members, including Albania, Brazil, Gabon, Ghana, Ireland, Kenya, Mexico and Norway, voted in favor. Far from being isolated from the international community, despite the sweeping sanctions, Vladimir Putin has managed to cement his ties with China. In his visit to Beijing in the first week of February, Moscow and Beijing entered into a deep strategic partnership with no limits, and where the two allies agreed that there are no forbidden areas of cooperation. Russia, through its strategic intervention in the Syrian civil war, has earned an ally in Bashar al-Assad. Since 2011, the United States pursued a policy of regime change in Syria by backing the rebels fighting against government, to oust Bashar al-Assad from Damascus. But Putin, through military aid from 2011 and direct military involvement in Syria from 2015, helped Assad turn the tide of the Syrian civil war. Russia has its only Mediterranean port in Syria at Tartus. It also exercises close control over the Syrian port of Latakia. This has turned Syria into a stout Russian ally in the region. Syria is the only other country after Russia to have recognized Donetsk and Luhansk as independent republics. Russian Deputy Prime Minister Yuri Borisov was on a whirlwind tour of the leftist nations in the Western Hemisphere from 16th of February. He met the leaders of Venezuela, Cuba and Nicaragua and signed a series of strategic cooperation agreements on aspects such as trade, energy and financial cooperation. Russia's decisive intervention into Kazakhstan has reiterated Russia's position of preeminence in Central Asia. In the month of January, Kazakhstan erupted into a nationwide unrest sparked by a spike in fuel prices. But Russia, leading the CSTO troops, managed to crush the protests in a short and decisive operation. Most Central Asian nations have maintained friendly relations with Moscow and have not condemned Russia's invasion into Ukraine. So, although the United States has been working its diplomatic levers to isolate Russia for invading into Ukraine, Vladimir Putin so far in the conflict has successfully managed to call the American bluff and has also shored up support for the Russian nation. Maximilian Haas, who is a fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, joins us live from London for the latest unfolding in Ukraine. Maximilian, welcome to WION.
Thank you for having me.
What would be the strategic impact politically or military-wise if Russia successfully seizes Kyiv?
Well, that remains to be seen. It looks like the Ukrainian people are willing to fight a guerrilla war against Russia. Russia has fought a limited guerrilla war in Chechnya 20 years ago that was incredibly bloody and violent. But more Russians have apparently, according to Ukrainian numbers, already died in the 2 days of this conflict than died in that conflict. Even if Russia takes Kyiv, it faces the risk of fighting a guerrilla war in many cities, in Kyiv, in Kharkiv, in Dnipro, in Melitopol, in Mariupol, in Mykolaiv. The list goes on of places they've already attacked. So while the Russian military has a lot more capability than the Ukrainians, and certainly has the ability likely to seize these cities in the coming days, it doesn't have the ability to pacify them.
So where does Ukraine go from here? What happens next?
Well, that's a tragedy. It appears likely Ukraine will either be split in two or be forced to fight in a brutal guerrilla war that will undermine the strength of any future Ukraine and risks putting it in a situation like Syria or Yemen has been. However, I think that this sounds as if I'm speaking about a unilateral success for Vladimir Putin, and I would not say that. This is an unprovoked war of aggression, the third time that Putin has started a war of aggression in the last 15 years, and I think the international community is beginning to wake up, and we've seen that with sanctions, even from non-traditional U.S. partners on such issues like Singapore, joining in and condemning Russia, and Putin is in some ways laying the risks for his own potential fall from power by committing fratricide amongst the Slavic peoples of Russia and Ukraine, and is really beginning to undermine his own regime at home as well.
Maximilian, analysts argue that this invasion is a massive wake-up call for Europe. What do you make of that statement, and could this get any worse?
Well, I think it's a massive wake-up call for Western Europe, in particular Germany, the United Kingdom, places that have been all too willing to do business with Russia and the Russian state, despite its previous wars of aggression. Eastern Europe has been sounding the alarm for well over a decade now, and even before Russia's first invasion of Georgia. I think it does need to be a wake-up call not only for Western Europe, but also for the rest of the world, including countries like India that have good relations with Russia and the United States. But now it is very clear that Putin is an aggressor, somebody who starts wars for no reason other than his own desires. And I think that will be a wake-up call for the rest of the world. I certainly hope it will be.
Finally, we have moved from dialogue, diplomacy to joint and concerted actions by Western leaders, and to top the cream, stringent economic sanctions. Will this deter the Kremlin?
I don't think stringent economic sanctions right now are likely to deter the Kremlin. We've seen some of the most drastic measures announced in over 80 years against the major country, but the sanctions regime now essentially is very close to the sanctions regime on Iran. Of course, with an even larger number of states supporting it, because it was the United States that unilaterally reimposed those and reneged on its agreements with Iran under 2014. But the United States had made very clear, and so had the European Union, and to a lesser extent the United Kingdom, that these kind of sanctions were what would happen if Putin invaded Ukraine. It is Putin who has chosen to cut the Russian economy and the Russian people off from the financial world and the technological around the world. And it is Vladimir Putin who will bear responsibility for that over the long term. So I don't think it will deter him. He's made this choice knowingly, but I do think it will in the long term significantly affect the relationship between the Russian people who do not want war and who I believe are against this war, and the dictator who does want it and has forced it upon them.
Maximilian, what are the general ramifications of this conflict to the world?
The general ramifications of this conflict to the world are incredibly wide-reaching. I think, firstly, it really shows that the threat of a new world war that we had so long assumed was gone, perhaps in some countries as a result of nuclear weapons, that is not the case. It has shown that there are still countries that believe they can unilaterally change borders by force. Putin has now done that twice in Ukraine and once in Georgia, and threatened to do so elsewhere. For the whole world, this has an impact. For example, for India and its relations with China, if China moves to support Putin on this, as it has given some indications it will, although I think he'll be upset at the lack of support thus far, that raises the potential for China to look to unilaterally change its borders with India, as it has threatened to do in the past as well. So I think it behooves the entire world, in particular democratic countries and countries that believe in the rule of law and believe in the inviolability of sovereign borders, to announce this and to oppose it in whatever way that they can.
Maximilian Haas, thank you very much for your insights and for talking to us on WION today. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.